Good morning and welcome to all of you that are joining us in this conversation. It's going to be a very exciting conversation. We're going to get some wonderful wisdom from our panelists in just a moment. And for those of you that will be resharing some of that wisdom, those insights on social, maybe just to remind you, please do so with the hashtag SDIM24. My name is Douglas McCauley. I'm a professor at the University of California. And we're going to talk today about the hard challenges of pollution. But not just the problems of pollution. Of course, we'll talk about some exciting, some optimistic opportunities to solve these problems. So when we say pollution, obviously we're talking about a lot of different factors. And for folks that know the dialogues and the work, the action in World Economic Forum on the subject of pollution, know that typically we sort of drill down in WEF. It's a conversation about plastic pollution, or it's a conversation, you might even say, in the climate track, of which there's a lot of action at WEF, that could even be considered a pollution challenge, an air pollution challenge, because we're emitting CO2. Greenhouse gases is the root cause of climate. But we're going to zoom out in our conversation today to talk about air pollution, to talk about water pollution, there's soil pollution. There are so many forms of pollution, but zooming out with the goal of hopefully finding some commonalities across this landscape of challenges that help us think of the shape of the problem and shapes, most importantly, of solutions. So I like talking about pollution, which is a rarely said thing. Perhaps some of my colleagues here do the same. My home is in California, and I've spent a lot of time around the San Francisco Bay at different universities throughout my career. And when my parents were living around the San Francisco Bay, it was a very different kind of place. It was an epicenter for pollution. I like talking about pollution because we find stories of optimism. There was one in the history of the Bay. Back when they were living there, the air stunk. The Bay, the solution for pollution was to put everything from industry around the city into the ocean there in the Bay. If people say that if you walked around the perimeter of San Francisco Bay and you had a silver coin in your pocket, it would tarnish, it would oxidize because of the interactions between the water pollution and the air pollution. But if you fast forward, as a result of a grand social movement, Earth Day came together because things got so bad. We had policy that followed on with ambition, business action. People today run by the Bay instead of running from the Bay. Real estate at the edge of the Bay is now some of our most valuable real estate instead of being our least valuable real estate. And people made millions of dollars in a good way around innovation for pollution. So there are those hope spots. I want to search for some of those hope spots, talk about some of those solutions, but acknowledge too that pollution is a forever challenge. As our economy modernizes, the challenge evolves. We have new forms of pollution. We need new kinds of innovative multi-stakeholder solutions to tackle those challenges. So we have the right folks here to get in that conversation about multi-stakeholder solutions to pollution. So Leslie Johnson joining us as CEO of the Loudest Foundation in Switzerland. Stefan Klebert, CEO of GIA, based in Germany and with the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders. And Jane Burston, CEO of the Clean Air Fund based in the UK and one of WEF's young global leaders. Well, welcome to you all. To sort of set the stage for us today, to get into the gravity of pollution, maybe Jane, Leslie, I expect your world is a bit like mine, saturated with numbers. We can think of a statistic to extract. I'll lead the charge. I do a lot of geeky reading in my world of science. So in The Lancet, a leading medical journal, there was a statistic published a few years ago that 1 out of 6 deaths was caused by pollution, which is really, for me, brought home the magnitude and the gravity of that challenge. Can I invite you to throw out a statistic to just warm us up to what are we up against in pollution?
Sure. Well, I'm going to talk about clothes. And with clothes, 92 million tons go to landfill every year, which is about a garbage truck every second, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation.
Wow. Anything to throw out, Jane?
Yeah, so I mean, building on that stat from the Lancet, a really large part of those deaths are from air pollution. It's 1 in 8 deaths around the world every single year are from air pollution. And unfortunately, this year, air pollution overtook smoking as the second leading cause of death. And unlike lots of other health risks, it's actually getting worse. So deaths from air pollution are forecast to double by 2050 unless we do something.
I want to come to you, but I just want to, Stefan, in a moment, but just this issue, I feel like the invisibility of air pollution. So we all have got, I think, the challenges around smoking. Why are we not seeing the challenges, a clear and present risk to us with smoking? Why are we not making the same connections with other forms? Why is it more invisible with other forms of air pollution?
Well, until very recently, actually, nobody has had air pollution written as the cause of death on their death certificate. That actually changed in the UK a couple of years ago when a mother whose daughter had died from a very severe asthma attack protested and got the inquest into the death reopened. And having looked at all of the evidence, the coroner found that actually air pollution was the cause of this asthma attack. And for the first time now, air pollution has been written as the cause of death. But that's one person. That mother is very brave and is catalysing a lot of policy change in the UK. But most people don't understand that their heart attack, the lung cancer, the asthma, the stroke was brought on by air pollution. And so they see the illness, but they don't see the cause.
Well, I want to dig into that more, but Stefan, we need a voice. I want some insight from your world in business. So we're aware, science is aware, business is aware that anything we make, anything that we buy, things we see on the shelf, everything has a footprint, and that's a carbon footprint, a water footprint. But this issue of invisibility, how are we doing in terms of measuring pollution footprints? How is GIA doing in terms of thinking about the relative impact or role of pollution when we come to making products and selling products? And what are some of your colleagues out there doing that you respect?
Yeah, I think first of all, the most important thing I feel is that we make it a topic, that we talk about it, what we do here, because as you just mentioned, I think in the past it was not really the awareness of people. Everybody knew that sometimes the air is not great from the quality point of view, but it was kind of hidden issue, and I think it's important that we start to talk about it. In GIA, we also started to join different organizations to help to make this a topic, like with the Clear Air Fund, for instance, or with the CEO Climate Alliance, where I'm participating in the WEF, and with being a member of these groups, we also started to measure it. So what is our pollution? What do we contribute to a bad world, let's say? And there is the old saying, what gets measured gets done. And I think that's the basic where everything starts, and that is important, and I'm very happy that we now start to measure all that. And then we can address it, and we can do something against it.
Is it harder to measure, do you think, Stefan? I mean, it's no small challenge to measure a carbon footprint, but is it harder to measure pollution?
I think so, yes. I mean, carbon pollution and air pollution very often comes together and is influencing each other. But it's difficult. Yeah, it's also difficult, to be honest, to measure CO2 pollution. I mean, you all know what we are talking about. But we are on a journey all together, I feel, and we have to make it happen. And this is where everything starts: create awareness, get it measured, and put the right actions into place to decrease the pollution. I think that's the name of the game. Yeah.
Right. Jane, can I ask again? Just keep going with air pollution. So you highlighted that in some ways this is one of the most well-known impacts. It's like smoking. Of course, that's another form, you might even say, of air pollution. But we know that there are links. You already gave us some examples about impacts on human health and well-being. But where are we in our general understanding of the impacts of micropollutants on people, on the distribution of air pollution, micropollutants in the air? Can you just give us a better sense of the state of things in the case of air pollution?
Sure. So, I mean, every year we find out more about the health impacts. So I've talked about some of the more common ones. More recently, we've found that it can also cause dementia. It's linked to Parkinson's disease. and it has a really big impact on babies, and including unborn babies. It's causing up to a third of miscarriages in Southeast Asia. So there's all of these links that we're finding out all of the time. Something that's under-researched is also the impact on our economies. You probably imagine if it's 1 in 8 deaths and then all of those illnesses that people are suffering with during their lives, that's a really big burden on the health system. So the World Bank calculates the health damages cost globally 6% of GDP. But it also costs businesses because of the loss of productivity. So, if you're off sick from work because you're suffering from asthma or you have one of these other illnesses, that's a cost to the business sector. And what we calculated alongside the Confederation of British Industry in the UK is if the UK met the World Health Organization limits for air pollution, what they say would be safe, businesses would save 1.6 billion a year because of the 3 million working days that they would get back from people not being off work sick or not having to be off work looking after sick children. So this actually will pay for itself. The solutions are there, and if we implement them, then the economies will grow as a result.
That's a really interesting and powerful observation. I mean, maybe I'll just see if anyone else has anything to feed on top of that, because we always think of dealing with pollution, that's going to cost us. That's going to cost. You have to stick a new thing on whatever you're making on your factory. It's going to cost. It's going to cost government money. It's going to cost cities money. But do you see any of the instance where it actually is economically rational, where we're making money by addressing pollution? I suppose in some ways, pollution is about you're losing a thing. You're putting some product into the water or air, so there's an efficiency. You might hope that we see efficiency gains, to say nothing of the gains for having a healthier workforce and healthier customer base. But do you see win-wins for economy and pollution?
Well, I think there's always trade-offs, so I would be careful to say win-win-win. But I do think, though, when you're looking at pollution, especially when it comes to textile waste, which is an area we work in as a foundation, there are opportunities. And, I mean, the optimist in me says, well, there shouldn't even be waste. If you have pure circularity, you would not have textile waste at all. But the reality, as I said in the beginning, is that you have millions and millions of pounds of waste that are going to places in Ghana and India and actually creating economic and ecological challenges, but also opportunities. So one of the things that we're doing as a foundation is actually supporting grassroots organizations that can actually empower the waste pickers, help them diversify and get more income from this opportunity, so that, I mean, these are their livelihoods, and set up businesses that could actually repurpose this waste. We were just talking before we started about different sort of nonprofits that are doing that and actually linking into larger supply chains of big multinationals. So that's one thing you can do, but I would argue you need to look at the root of the problem and actually do everything you can, including changing the policy environment to actually prevent that waste from happening in the first place.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, for me as a CEO of a large company producing machinery and equipment for the food, pharma and beverage industry, maybe I have to say that to give you a bigger picture. I'm always very happy that we start talking about how to decrease CO2 pollution, how to decrease the air pollution, because it's not only that I wish that there is a safe planet for my children, at the same time I see a huge business opportunity, and that makes it really a win-win situation. So producing food and beverages is very highly energy intensive, and a lot of our customers are still using fossil fuels, gas, natural gas mainly. If you bake cookies, or if we do pasta machines, for instance. Every fourth spaghetti worldwide comes from our machine and equipment. The famous Oreo cookies, everybody knows, are coming from our machines and equipment. And all this needs energy. And we are focusing our R&D very much during the last 2 and 3 years on developing more sustainable solutions, so decrease the energy consumption. That was never ever before at the mind of an engineer. Every engineer wanted to make it faster, more quality, more output, but nobody was really thinking, how can I do the same thing with 30-40% less energy? Or how can I do it instead of natural gas with sustainable energy? And that is now really at the forefront of our development, and we see more and more customers being interested in this kind of development because they all are under pressure to decrease their CO2 emissions, and that also, like I said, is kicking in also in the overall topic of decreasing the air pollution. So when we came up with a lot, I could talk hours about our innovations, and I'm very happy because this is really boosting the business as well, and therefore for me, it's really a great thing for technology companies like ours because we do something good for the world. Our purpose, our claim, our company claim is engineering for a better world, and this is what we do, and where all our skill can flow in, that we do something which helps the world to become a better place, and at the same time it's a business opportunity and growth opportunity for us.
Wonderful. Well, we don't have the opportunity to talk for hours, but I want to come back in a moment and talk more about examples of innovation. And I will say I will never look at a package of spaghetti quite the same. It's good to know that there's so much thought going behind. Of course, like I said, there are these stories, these sustainability stories for every product. But I'll have more to think about next time I'm in the supermarket.
Right.
Leslie, you mentioned textile pollution. I'm a bit behind the curve on textile pollution, so maybe I can ask you unpack that a little bit more for us. Tell us just the origin story of the challenge and the problem. What are you doing? You mentioned a little bit of the international character of this issue, but take us into textile pollution.
Sure. So it is actually probably the elephant in the room because I don't think people fully realize how bad the problem is. And the challenge with textile pollution, I mean, I gave the numbers before, but effectively we wear about 20% of what's in our closets. Of those numbers that go to landfill, about 8% of landfills worldwide are textile waste. So it's a growing problem. And when I talk about pollution in textile, I mean, that's the waste element. There's also a water element. There's also a carbon element. I mean, the fashion industry emits about 8 to 10% of emissions globally. And that's a challenge because the industry grows as populations grow, and then we're not seeing that curve changing. So unless we make some vast changes to the business model, the carbon footprint of fashion will continue to get worse. So why is this an issue? Well, I think first and foremost, it's really challenging because I think something like 80 or 90% of the carbon emissions are the scope 3 element of the industry, which means it's really far-flung, it's far away, it's hard for brands and retailers to influence that. We're talking about, you talked about the hidden sort of element of pollution. This is deep in the middle of the supply chain. Something like 60% of emissions are actually in that processing activity over which brands and retailers have very little influence. Dye houses, spinning mills, that sort of thing. So it's a really tough problem, and it's actually embedded in the supply chain. That's number one. And I think number two, there isn't sufficient rules in the system that incentivize perhaps brands to think differently. And by rules, I'm talking about policy, and I'm not just talking about sticks. I think there's a lot of really interesting things you can do around incentives to try to change the way that these businesses are operating. So what are we doing about it? So I'll talk a little bit about how philanthropy can play a role. We are a philanthropic foundation that's really trying to use what I like to call the kind of catalytic power of philanthropy to enable the industry to step up and lead. So in this area, there's two things we're doing that I think are being quite effective. The first one is we find that business as usual in the fashion industry is not going to get us where we're going to go, so we need innovation. But innovation is very difficult to scale, and there's a lot of challenges around that. So one of the first things that we did a couple years ago was set up an innovation platform called Fashion for Good, which effectively takes innovation into the pre-competitive space. And why is that important for pollution? Well, one of the biggest innovations that has yet to really get to scale is chemical recycling. And chemical recycling is super important because most clothes blend technical and biological. So you need chemical recycling to basically get the fiber back out and reuse it. And that's not quite where it needs to be. So we need more innovation. So that's number one. As a foundation, we play a role helping to make that happen. And that actually covers about 12% of the industry. But the other thing we need is changing the rules of the system. So I mentioned carrots and sticks. I'm really excited. That sounds like I'm really excited. I'm very excited about EPR regulation because I think extended producer responsibility, which negatively you could say it's polluter pays. Positively, you could say this is about product stewardship. We're actually really trying to get accountability in the industry. For anything you make, you need to make sure it's not actually doing damage to the earth. So EPR is really important. We've been very involved in that through our partners. In 2027, 28 in Europe, we will start to see requirements that textile waste has to be separated, and we can start that journey to putting that in action.
I love it. And I'm going to borrow your rebranding of EPR as product stewardship or planet stewardship or even customer stewardship. Yes. I love it. So you mentioned before in your remarks about textile pollution some different geographies, the sort of international character of the challenge. You mentioned different geographies when talking air pollution. Could we talk a little bit about the justice dimension, environmental justice dimension of pollution? So invite anyone to share stories or observations from where you work, but it certainly strikes me another whole set of statistics about those that are most burdened by pollution or those that least deserve or can afford to carry more burden. What do you see in any of the domains you're working about disparities and burden from pollution?
Yeah, with air pollution, it's actually something that all of us experience. So 99% of the world's population are breathing unhealthy air. But you're right, the burden is disproportionately on poorer people. And that's wherever you are in the world, actually. Poorer people are more likely to live by the side of a busy road, next to an industrial facility, and not be able to move away. We also need to be quite careful about the burden of the policies or the things that we introduce to reduce pollution. And make sure that they're affordable and accessible to everybody. You know, we saw with climate change the Gilets jaunes movement in France, where people were protesting that they just could not afford to do the green thing. So we need to make sure that these solutions are accessible to everybody, and we've taken everybody's circumstances into account.
Maybe just adding to that, because I think I talked a little bit about the economic opportunities around waste. So the work in India that we're doing is with an organization called Upaya, which effectively is supporting through financing community groups to realize value from the waste. So that is a good thing. It helps to hopefully bring some more, economic justice to those groups. And more importantly, I think it's really important that these groups are heard, that they're part of the solutions that are being crafted. And what I'm very excited about is one of our partners in Ghana, the Orr Foundation, is actually shining light on the textile pollution that you see there, because a lot of these clothes get shipped to Ghana. There's one of the world's largest textile recycling centers there, and just piles and piles and piles. And even took some of the workers to Europe to actually make sure their voice is heard, to the policymakers that are crafting CSDDD legislation. So you really understand what is the impact, and as you say, the impact of legislation in one place like Europe and what that means for people on the ground in a place like Ghana. And that can be very powerful.
Thanks for bringing those voices. Thanks for the work in those regions. It certainly elevates what's at stake here for this. Stefana, I wanted to pick up a little bit on innovation, which I mentioned we'd come back to and has popped up here and there. So we're also going to tick a box because it's World Economic Forum. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence. We can't complete a panel until AI has entered the conversation. But what kinds of things are AI, but broadly innovation, whether that's new robotics, new chemistry? What kind of role do you see innovation and tech playing in combating pollution? What's happening in GIA? What's happening elsewhere in the general landscape?
Yep. Let me start. The name GEA, by the way, means Gesellschaft für Entstaubungsanlagen, which is a German difficult word. I tried to translate it. It's called a company to build equipment to remove dust. That was really the beginning of the company in 1920. And is still a part, even if the company changed completely, 80% of the business is food, beverage, pharma, but we still have a lot of know-how in technology, in filtration technology, to really remove dust from the air. But as I said before, many industries need a lot of power, energy, especially food industry. And it's not only that we have to wait for fancy AI applications or to digitalize everything. We can also change many things with technologies which are existing a long time. I'll give you one example. We also produce spray dryers. The vast majority of milk is converted into powder first because it's easier to ship. New Zealand, for instance, is the largest producer of milk worldwide. And all this milk is converted into powder with spray dryers and then shipped into the world and converted back to milk or infant formula or yogurt or whatever. And this kind of spray dryers is a huge installment where you blow in microparticles of the milk and then you put in hot air, and when the milk particles are flowing out to the wall of the large cylinder, they are dried and then they fall down and you have the powder. Very traditional technology. And this is normally done with all the spray dryers worldwide with natural gas, which is highly energy intensive. We developed the technology and we now installed the first spray dryer ever worldwide, where we combined a spray dryer with a heat pump. Heat pump is a very common technology since years. It's not fancy AI, but we developed a large one. We combined it with the spray dryer and we save 50% of the energy.
Wow.
That equals about 4,000 households, the saving of the energy. And we are working on new heat pumps where we can substitute the natural gas completely. So there are a lot of existing technologies which could be used to make all equipment worldwide, not only the food and beverage industry, more efficient. And I think that is the name of the game, and that is what we have to push for. And of course, digitization and AI also helps. We also have digital solutions which we put, for instance, on exactly the same spray dryers where customers don't want to change to a heat pump system because they don't trust that, and it's a very conservative industry. The food industry has a lot to do with food safety and so on. But we also have digital solution where AI is helping to substitute a very experienced operator of this spray dryer with a system, with a digital solution. It saves about 18 to 90% of energy. It's also a lot. And this is, for instance, digital solution. So there are many, many technologies around. And as more you focus your engineers on things like that, as more ideas are coming up, because it was never, ever on the mind and on the focus of all technology companies worldwide.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks to the top-down forcing to get that, and that stimulus for innovation in engineering teams and to continue that trend. And hopefully, to our conversation before about costs and pollution, those efficiency gains, perhaps not always, but those efficiency gains translate into reductions in costs. That would be the ultimate hope, right? Great examples. Leslie, you mentioned the work that you're doing. We're covering a lot of space for different actors that need to come together to create solutions for pollution, but you're doing a lot of work with communities. You mentioned your communities, your colleagues in Ghana and India. Mm-hmm. How does that fit in? It feels like such a big problem. You've called attention to the very international character of the problem, but where do communities fit in to creating solutions to these pollution challenges?
Well, that's a great question, because that is essentially what I've been talking about all week here at New York Climate Week, because I think that as companies are embracing the need to accelerate a just transition, because we all know companies need to decarbonize their supply chains, but they need to do it in a way that leaves no one behind. The core question is, how do we bring communities along? And I find we're at a really exciting time right now because we're all trying to figure out how to do this. For us, there's three things that are really important when we talk about communities, and these are core to the tenets of a just transition, which effectively are inclusivity, agency, and accountability. And accountability is really important, because I mentioned EPR, the thing that gets me very excited. Policy sort of is so important for kind of raising those lagging companies, but it's not good enough for the leaders to continue to rise. So we need mechanisms to create more transparency and accountability for the companies to do the right thing that can benefit communities. What we see in fashion is that often communities aren't at the table. So a lot of our work, and this is where philanthropy can be interesting, a lot of our work is to make sure that their voice is heard, whether it's, as I mentioned, bringing the waste workers to go talk to policymakers, or even making sure through partners in Europe that the impact on garment workers, for example, of legislation around the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that it's a positive thing and not a negative thing. So those voices need to be brought in, and that's one thing that we do quite a lot of work on. The other thing that I think is really important is that we need to realize anything that happens in the European or US space, policy-wise, will impact producing countries and could impact communities negatively, whether it's the European Deforestation Act, for example, or other directives that are coming through. So we just need to understand what are those knockoff effects and how do we make sure that in producing countries in the global south that communities can be better off. And if they're not better off, how can we mitigate any risks to them? And again, that's fashion, very important, but also very relevant to probably a lot of other industries that we work in.
It's not easy,
Yes.
but I mean, when has an important challenge ever been easy? But that very globalized character, I don't think necessarily about a decision in the U.S., home for me, how it would necessarily impact these global system dynamics around pollution, but we need to. That's a very good
Yes.
point. Yeah. Jane, I wanted to ask, we were talking a little bit about air pollution before we began the panel. We was reaching back to prior generation recollections and relationships with pollution. Even in my generation, things have got a bit better in my home. I remember there used to be smog. I grew up in Los Angeles. There used to be smog days, right? They'd cancel school. It was, I mean, not quite like a snow day because you didn't get school, but you didn't get to go outside, right? You were stuck inside. It was the worst. It was the worst. But we don't have those really anymore in Los Angeles. Surely, and as I know, there are these challenges with smog in many other cities. But then there are other next generation challenges with air pollution in California and challenges all around the world with air pollution. What are we missing with air pollution? What do we need to know? What do we need to do to catch up and to just deal with these historic but also new emerging challenges in air pollution? What are we missing, Jen?
We're missing quite a bit. I think definitely good data in a lot of places, funding to do something about it, business action by and large. There are some great examples, but businesses are really behind the curve on this. And I think also integration of air pollution action and climate change action. So I can unpack those a little bit. I think on data, we know that more than a third of countries worldwide don't measure air pollution at all. They don't have the capacity and the equipment. So they're unable to measure their baseline. They can't track progress. They might not know what the different sources are or how to tackle it. So that's something that really development agencies and banks need to focus on, is getting those countries the capability to at least know what the baseline is and make that transparently available to citizens. On funding, it's really lacking for air pollution. The Clean Air Fund that I run runs a report every year called the State of Global Air Quality Funding. And what we found last year was that only 1% of international development aid and 2% of international public climate finance was also tackling air pollution. So a real drop in the ocean compared to this 1 in 8 deaths from air pollution. You know, you look at these two things and you think that the amount of money is nowhere near the scale of the problem. And the funding isn't very evenly distributed either. So we know that only 5% of that small amount of money that exists is going to African countries, where they have 5 of the top 10 most polluted countries by head of population. And they've got some of the biggest growing cities in the world. You know, I was in Ghana a couple of months ago and visited a city called Tamale, which just before the pandemic was one of the fastest growing cities in the world. It used to have 90% of trips done by people who lived there by cycle or motorcycle. They've just got brilliant, beautiful new road has been laid, no cycle lanes, no pavements, and now it looks pretty dangerous to cycle. You know, it's fast to drive your car, there's no potholes, there's this beautiful road, but, you know, the cars are able to travel much more quickly, and all of a sudden, you know, whilst in some parts of the world we're trying to encourage people back onto their bicycles, in the parts of the world where people are already on their bicycles, we're not making it easier for them, we're making it much harder. So, you know, dedicating the funding to these fast-growing cities where maybe pollution isn't a problem right now, but it might be in the future unless we do something. Business action, it's really great hearing these examples from Gia about what you're doing, and I know that you've joined this Alliance for Clean Air that the World Economic Forum and the Clean Air Fund set up. There's 20 businesses in that alliance really kind of pushing the boundaries on measuring their pollution footprint and taking action to reduce it. 20. It's not a very large number in the grand scheme of things, especially given how climate and air quality action can be very well aligned. So coming on to that final point about the integration of climate and air quality action, I think Stefan said at the beginning of this conversation that lots of air pollution is from burning fossil fuels. About 2/3 of the outdoor air pollution that we're exposed to is from fossil fuels. And obviously fossil fuels are the main cause of the climate crisis, so if the causes are the same, the solutions can be the same: renewable energy, reducing the power consumption of products, more walking and cycling, clean transport and clean industry. But we don't always, in policy terms, think of the two things together. So we saw in Europe, for example, something that really got exacerbated with Dieselgate, but this decision that Europe would go for diesel fuel over petrol because the carbon emissions are lower, but the pollution is higher. So we need to be making the decisions of the future, like what fuel will shipping use, bearing in mind not just the carbon footprint, but the kind of health footprint too. What's going to be the implications of these products in the future?
Thank you. Definitely give me a sense that there is some value in having this as a big tent conversation for pollution, right? Because as you said, when you're working on climate, you also have these other wins, and thinking about advances in solutions in the climate space allow us to sort of consolidate that impact of those wins. Stefan, one of the points you brought up was about coalition building and collaboration. You shared some examples of what you're doing internally in GIA. Can you share a few examples of what's happening, collaboration externally? Because it seems like we need some good forward-thinking companies like GIA, but we need lots of them and lots of them sharing and collaborating. Can you give us some examples from that space?
I'd like to. I think for us it's important that we join this kind of valuable initiatives like the Clean Air Fund, for instance, like the CEO Alliance for Climate Leadership, because this all helps to create awareness. And I know that only a very few companies are really thinking in that direction. And it's a pity, but the only thing we can do is really to talk about that. What we do also with our suppliers, we made it already 3 years ago. We made our supplier day. We focused it on sustainability only, and we said very clear to all the suppliers: if you want to stay a preferred supplier at GEA, you have to fulfill this and this and this until 26. For instance, we want to have them SBTI validated targets. We want to have certain certifications from them. Many things we defined, and this is the pressure we can put on other companies. But at the end, it's about joining forces, about working together, about creating the awareness. And what we can also do is to create the technologies and also talk about these technologies. And sometimes it is a bit more expensive at the first stage, but it can also help. If, for instance, the example I told you before with the spray dryer, companies save a hell of money. It's not only an investment, they save a hell of money. And I have a very nice anecdote, by the way. The company I told you where we first installed this spray dryer, it's Arla Food, by the way. I can mention that it's the largest organic milk company from Denmark. And they got a call from their natural gas provider in Denmark asking if something is wrong in production because they felt that the consumption dropped significantly. So this is a real story.
Yeah. These stories are powerful.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk for hours, as you said before. We need to bring our conversation a bit to a close, at least for the moment. Can I invite you each to share something else from your wish list? You've thrown out a few things on your wish list, but for pollution, what's at the top of your wish list in the short or long term? Leslie?
I'll kick off.
Please.
So I always talk about if you want to tackle these deeply systemic problems like pollution, you need to change more the underlying kind kind of forces that perpetuate it. So excuse me for a sec while I get philosophical, but for me there's three things we need to change, which is mindsets, rules, and power. And with mindsets, I mean, it's all about sort of how money flows and how we look at this as an opportunity. I think there are investable opportunities around here. I mean, one reason why we set up Fashion for Good is actually to bring innovators to the table and unlock financing to actually tackle the wastewater and carbon issues in the fashion industry. So turning what is actually a challenge into an opportunity, an investable opportunity, is very exciting. Rules, we talked about rules, my love affair with EPR, but it goes beyond that. I think there's a lot around accountability, and then also incentives. You think about, look what's happening with the IRA in the US. There's a lot of really interesting incentives there that's changing company behavior. How can we do more of that in other parts of the world? But the last thing I would say is my wish list really is around these power dynamics, because we talked a bit about communities. As we said, communities don't always have a voice. They're not visible. How do we balance those power dynamics, make sure that they're included in the discussions, they're included in the designing the solutions, but also are part of the solution. I think one thing that's really important when we talk about farmers, garment workers, communities, tenants, they are part of the solution. They're not a group of people that have things done to them. They should, be able to actually step up and co-create these solutions. So that's where I think philanthropy can play a really important role, but we're not there yet. And my last wish on that is every transition plan that a company develops has inclusivity and agency for the communities they impact embedded in that plan. And we're not there yet.
I only gave you one wish. I can only grant one, but I want to grant them all. Jane, do you have a wish to throw out there?
I think top of my list would be the better integration of air pollution and climate action. We've talked about how the causes are the same, so the solutions can be the same. What we didn't talk about is actually work on air pollution can often be less politically divisive. Yeah. You can't argue with better health for children, reduced asthma attacks, a lower burden on the national health system. So I think if policymakers prioritise the two things at once, not only would it be more economically efficient, you get two wins for the price of one, but also people might be more behind the kind of climate actions that right now people feel uncertain about.
Wonderful. We need to have another conversation another day, how to replicate that consensus around the need for action on air pollution and other pollution spaces. But Stefan, your wish.
Well, I wish that there is a bit more openness for technologies which exist and which really could help. For instance, I did not mention so far carbon capture and storage, at least in Germany or in Europe, not in England, but in some parts of Europe. Meaningless discussions from my point of view about storage, but we have the technology to take carbon out of the air. So we also have technology to take out more than 90% of the CO2 of a cement factory, and cement is one of the biggest polluters worldwide. So we could equip all cement factories worldwide with a technology that they take out 90% of the carbon CO2 footprint. But we need to store it because we have to do something with that. But I think at least for the next 20 years, until technologies will be created to avoid that, it is much better to have the CO2 under the earth instead of the air. And there is a lot of ideologies going on, a lot of discussions, same with nuclear power and things like that. We should do something immediately, and the technologies are there. So I would wish to have a more fact-based discussion on technologies instead of always defending ideologies.
Okay, this isn't fair because that's another hour of conversation that I really want to have. But I'm going to attempt to try to bring together, I guess, some of the themes that in the collective wisdom that you all aired here today. It seems that, to your point, technology is really important and is a source of optimism. I think you gave us some good insight that we need to be thinking about complements to technology. Can't save everything. Even as a Californian who thinks that technology can save and fix every situation, we need community empowerment and smart policy. It's a little trite to say, but I'm going to say it anyway in a World Economic Forum conversation, but we need multi-stakeholder action. We have all of you from different worlds that need to come together for these grand challenges of pollution, philanthropy. We need smart folks influencing policy and business there too. So we need these coalitions if we're actually going to take on these challenges. The last thing that I really absorbed was just the gravity of this for us, for our communities, but importantly for the many folks that actually are not streaming this, that to have that burden are more vulnerable, and that we deserve to give them our attention and our power and our intelligence with these solutions. So all of the solutions you shared, all the work you're doing, thank you for it. It gives me a great deal of optimism. I want to thank all of our viewers that are joining us today in the conversation. Hope you found a little bit of the same wisdom and insight that I found today, and perhaps some of that optimism as well. Thank you for joining, and have a good day.